It is my absolute honor to introduce you to Dr. Seth J. Frantzman. Now, Seth is the senior Middle East correspondent and analyst at the Jerusalem Post, which is Israel's leading English-speaking news outlet. Without any further ado, please, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Seth J. Frantzman.
It's a very nice introduction. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's really humbling to be here, and it's an honor to be before you today to speak about this book and some of my own experiences, and then we'll do a Q&A. So if you feel like I haven't answered something that you're particularly interested in, whether it's Hamas or Iran or Russia or whatever you'd like, Trump, it doesn't matter. I'm happy to answer those questions and what we can take it on whatever tangent, but I'll give the talk that I'd like to give and some of the background. So I think I'll start a little bit at the end. On November 5th of 2024, I was invited by the Israel Defense Forces to go into Gaza on a kind of embed. Journalists are not able to just wander around Gaza. This isn't the Vietnam War or what have you, right? I mean, everything's very compartmentalized now. If you're a war correspondent or a journalist, especially in Israel, and especially a place like Gaza, it's dangerous. So the IDF invited me down there to go with one or two other journalists, and at the time, in November, they were fighting in northern Gaza. The IDF had been already fighting for about 13 months by that point. So, and I'd been in Gaza before, and I've been in other places, other war zones. And the first time I went into Gaza, we went in an armored personnel carrier, an APC. Israel has several types of APCs. They have old M113s, which you're maybe familiar with from the Vietnam War, which aren't very big and are pretty clunky. And it's bizarre that actually Israel still uses them. It's not supposed to be using them in combat anymore, but they are being used for other things. In fact, some of them have been roboticized, so they're actually unmanned now. Israel has another type of APC called a Namer, which actually is based on the Merkava tank chassis. So if you look at a Merkava tank and you imagine you just rip the turret off and then chuck it somewhere, that's what it looks like. And then they have a new one called an Eitan, which has this big wheels and is very comfortable and very modern. So the first time I went in, we went in one of the Namers, and I remember getting in there. I'm kind of a big guy. I'm maybe not meant for this kind of action, and you're wearing a big pressed bulletproof vest as well, so you're even larger. And we were all sandwiched in there with a bunch of soldiers, and there's no room. And I was at the end of the vehicle, and I don't like small spaces. I don't even like elevators. If I have to go up 5 floors, I'll walk. I don't want to be stuck in some place. And you're in this machine. They lock this huge door behind you that's about this thick, and you're thinking, okay, if something goes wrong, I'll never get out of this situation. I mean, I don't know how to open the door. I don't understand all the gadgets. And we drove into Gaza, and it's on treads, so it churns a lot. There's lots of noise. And I had a little screen next to me, and I could see out. And I understood at that point, you wouldn't take a vehicle like this deep in. We were going into Jabalia, which is next to in northern Gaza, from near Gaza City, a place that's absolutely a terrorist hotspot and just a nest of terrorists and tunnels and the worst possible people. It was one of the places that the terrorists who attacked Kfar Aza, if you've ever been down to the Gaza border, where Kfar Aza was one of the worst massacre sites. The terrorists actually emerged from Jabalia, and they crossed some fields to get there, and then they killed people. So actually, prior to going into Gaza at that time, we'd had to drive through the kibbutz, which was still a bit in ruins, and we kind of done it in reverse trajectory, how the terrorists had come across the field. We went the other way going in. And I remember just thinking, we're in this big armored vehicle. And the reason for this is it's not only it's still dangerous. I mean, and they're still terror. They don't know where the terrorists are. They can pop out of tunnels and stuff. And as you know, with Hamas, on October 7th, they all wore uniforms. But the second the war actually started, they chucked out the uniforms and they just dressed as civilians, and they put away their rifles and just pretended to be civilians so they could take pot shots at the IDF. And then if they get killed, they can chalk it up as another civilian was killed. So that was my first experience. My last experience in Gaza in November of 2024. I remember telling my wife, I was like, I really don't like these embeds that much because I hate driving in these tiny armored vehicles with too many people. I was like, it's a bit much. And I said, well, I hope we get down there. I wonder what they'll send us in, what we'll be allowed to go in with. And when I got there, 2 Humvees drove up, open-topped Humvees. And I thought, Humvees, that's great. We're not going to be stuck in an APC this time. And we got in the Humvee, and the Humvees are not, it's a nice ride. It's comfortable in the back. And we're driving into northern Gaza from an area near Zikim, which is on the Mediterranean coastline. So we're actually driving along the water. And as you probably know with Gaza, it's actually a beautiful coastline. It's an area that should have been a paradise. I mean, it should have been built, and it should never have been taken over by Hamas. It should have been run like a normal country, and then you'd have a, beach promenade and everything you'd expect in a coastal area. So unfortunately, it is not that. But we went in, and as we drove in, you could see a lot of ruined houses and destruction, and there were no people. There was just us and our Humvees. No, actually, there were no soldiers either. It was strange, very quiet. And this had been 13 months of war. And what we saw was not only the destruction of the war, but how much things had changed in the sense of this is an area we were going into that on October 7th, terrorists had come running out of to attack Israel and massacre people. Zikim, for instance, not far from where we drove in, there's a beach there. That's a very beautiful beach. And terrorists actually attacked the beach and massacred a bunch of people. There's a video of that massacre. It shows people hiding in a small restroom that you'd have at a beach, a changing room. And you see in one video, you see the people alive and they're crouching and hiding and crying and they don't know what's happening. There's one soldier at the door. And then the next video, they're all dead. So you obviously know it didn't work out. And that's what had happened in Zikim. So these memories are with you when you're going in, and you feel that, in a sense, the tables have turned now. The IDF was really in control at that point of northern Gaza. This is an area that under the recent ceasefire, the IDF has left now. And we went to an area in a house. The IDF had occupied the house, a multi-story house. And the second floor or third floor, the IDF had put blankets over all the windows, turned the lights down, and it had become a command center for the general and the major who were in charge of that operations. Israel's commanders tend to always like to lead from the front. So they were hanging out there. And on one screen, they could see all the different units around them. As you could imagine, one of those old movies from, I don't know, World War II or whatever, where they're pushing the little units with a stick or something on a map. So now war is kind of the same, but it's all just digital. So you just see it all happening in real time but you have drones and all this different stuff. So it was interesting. And that was a sense that, we talk about, actually, I think there's a board back there that says victory. We talk about victory or total victory, or we've heard things like hell breaking loose in Gaza. Look, to some extent, I think that 13 months of war, there was a part of it was victory because controlling the land after a battle, that's part of victory. And certainly in a sense of hell breaking loose, a lot of Gaza has been devastated, for better or for worse. I mean, the terrorists brought this on Gaza, but unfortunately the civilians pay a lot of the price. In any war, civilians pay the price. I mean, whether it's Stalingrad or the Battle of Gettysburg or whatever you like, I mean, the civilians end up usually paying the price of what happens. And that's happened all across Gaza, but especially in the north, where some areas like just to give an example, in Jabalia, I think an IDF decided to go back there in October of 2024. So that's 12 months into the war. So it was the third time they'd gone into the same place. And I'd actually been there before in the early part of the war in the APC. And so I got to see it a few times, but it was the third time they'd gone into the same place. And the third time they went in, there were still 70,000 civilians estimated to be there. Now, when the war started, Jabalia is a built-up area. It's also a refugee camp from the 50s, so you can imagine it's a huge number of people crammed into a small area. But the crazy thing is that the people had not evacuated, despite all the requests of the IDF. Please leave, please leave, please leave, please leave. And there were still 70,000 people. The IDF had to wait for them to leave. It took weeks. And then when the IDF did go in, they estimated they found or eliminated, detained, or killed around several thousand terrorists, 2,000 or 3,000. So you can imagine 2,000 or 3,000 out of 70,000 people, 2,000 or 3,000 terrorists hiding among them, right? So that's what, 5% of the population, I guess, if you do the math like that. So out of a room like this, imagine, these 4 people are terrorists, everyone else is civilian. And then the terrorists dress like civilians, so it's kind of hard to find them. But what the terrorists did was they would stay around and hide out. And the IDF had kept finding these cells. And so when we were there, they'd finally gotten rid of most of them, but they're still there. And when the IDF finally left at the end of the war, or not the end of the war, the ceasefire, the terrorists came back up. You've seen those videos of the hostages being released. The terrorists all popped up, the uniforms went back on, and all of a sudden it's as if nothing had happened. And that's how Hamas would like to end the war. Obviously, they'd like to say, okay, we'll just turn the clock back to October 6th. Nothing happened here. We'll keep this. And Israel is obviously saying, well, hopefully not. I mean, we don't know. At the time giving this talk, we don't know where it's going to go. You can ask me questions about that. I may not be able to answer them, but that's starting at the end. Let's go back to the beginning just briefly. I had come here. I was born in Maine in the 80s. Actually 80. And so I grew up in the United States. I did my college BA in Arizona, and then I moved here in 2004. 2004. 2004. That's 4 years after 9/11. Something like that, right? Anyway, after 9/11, I was in university, and I really decided I would shift to studying more Middle East studies because I felt that that's kind of where the world was going to be focused. And I wanted to go work for the State Department at the time. I took the civil service exam and I passed, and then I didn't end up going work for them. But I decided I'd do my master's here in Israel because I felt that Jerusalem is the center of not only the Middle East, center of the world in some ways. And it sits on a fault line between East and West. And if you study here, you're in 1 foot in the West in a sense because it's Israel, and you can go over here and you're 1 foot in Jordan, and you're over here, you're in Iraq. I mean, it's very easy to move around the Middle East if you're centered here, I think. So I did my master's here, and then that was at the end of the Intifada, the second Intifada, which had been an absolutely brutal time. October 7th brings us back to that because in the second Intifada, there used to be bus bombings in Jerusalem very often, and some bus lines were bombed twice. And hundreds of people had died. As you probably recall, it was, I think, 1,000. There were a lot of civilians killed and wounded. But it took place over years, 2 or 3 years, right? Remember, it started, I think, in 2000, and then 2001, 2002 came along, and there was Operation Defensive Shield when the IDF went into the cities in the West Bank. Kind of like what's happening now, by the way, in the northern West Bank. This is the first time that the IDF has gone back in the cities with tanks and used airstrikes since the second Intifada. So we've gone back in a way, 25 years or 22 years, unfortunately. And the level of killing was bad, but it was drip of killing. October 7th was all of that on one day. All of it on one day. So you can imagine how bad it is in terms of the death. The death toll, I think, is hard to comprehend. It's more than 1,000 people killed, 250 taken hostage. I mean, it's just impossible to comprehend what it was. But I had been here during the end of the second Intifada, and one of my early memories here was as a college student, there was a disengagement when Israel decided to leave Gaza. And I had a few friends, and they were protesters. They wanted to protest against disengagement. They supported the Jewish communities there. And they decided to drive down there that night, the night before disengagement. Now, the IDF had cordoned off an area around Gaza, so it was hard to get down, but we decided we'd get down anyway. So we piled into a car, and we drove down. I wasn't an activist, but they were. So I figured I could get us around the checkpoints by driving on back roads, and we did. We managed to get to the border of Gaza, to Kisafim, which is one of the areas, by the way, it was attacked on October 7th. So it all comes back. All this comes full circle each time, for some reason. So Kisafim at the time was one of the areas the IDF went in they went in the morning to start taking people out. So I have a picture and a little scrapbook back home. In those days, remember when you took pictures and you had to print them out as opposed to they're just all on your phone. And if you lose this, they're in a cloud somewhere. So I have a little scrapbook of pictures that I printed out from, it says Gaza, I guess it was 2005, it says on it. And so we had this picture of the IDF, the first wave going in to bring people out. I mean, and we were even once we got there, we were sequestered with a few other civilians that had made it there to protest. There wasn't much to protest because it was just a few of us, and we got bored and we were tired. We'd been up all night, so we got back in the car and left. But it was interesting to have been there the day of disengagement, and I was also in Gaza prior to disengagement. I spent time in a place called Netzer Chazani, which was one of the Jewish communities there. So I had seen Gaza before, and then I saw it after. I saw the border change. You know, in those days before Iron Dome, I was there in 2009, and I remember we used to hide in these concrete shelters, and there'd be a siren, there was no Iron Dome. So you would just wait and kind of hope that a rocket didn't land kind of right where you were, because the shelters were kind of weird design. They were construction equipment because they hadn't standardized them yet. They would just drop one of these giant construction culverts and they'd put two walls at the end. But there's a space between the culvert and the end. And if a rocket falls in that space, it's over, I think. I mean, so you're kind of huddling in there thinking, well, and I remember one night we went out to sing because we were trying to bring a bit of support to the community of Sderot. I mean, in those days, it was just absolutely under bombardment. It was super depressing. Lots of people had left. And we went out to sing at night, some Jewish songs and stuff. And I remember the guys that took us out, we were just volunteers. They said, listen, there's a siren. Don't try to find a way to get to something. You'll just get hurt running. Just duck down and put something between you and Gaza. So if Gaza's over there, we just kind of be like this. And you think, yeah, I mean, this is effective in a sense, but if your luck runs out, your luck runs out. So that was before Iron Dome. Of course, it's all changed now. So I remember on the day of October 7th, I had just come back from the States. And I come back on Friday, I guess, before Shabbat, and I had a long flight, and you're so tired from the flight, and you know you're going to sleep in the next day. And I had a few drinks, and I thought, I'll just sleep in. It's Saturday. It's Simchat Torah. I'm nothing to do all weekend. And on Saturday, October 7th, I was awoken by one of my sons, and he came in the bedroom. It was about 8 a.m. in the morning. We were asleep. And he said, oh, there's sirens. There's sirens. He starts waking up. And I said, my wife starts waking me up. She said, there's sirens. I said, what sirens? And then we could kind of hear, because we live in Gilo, and part of Jerusalem, that it's a bit hard to hear the sirens because not every community is designed well. So I was like, why would there be sirens? Are they testing them? Is it a mistake? Is it possible that, there's something else has happened? Like, because, you could have a terrorist infiltration. Why would you put sirens on in Jerusalem? It can't possibly be from rockets, obviously. So I went out to the balcony. My balcony happens to face the West Bank, and thus it faces Gaza, about 40 miles away. And so you can hear the fighting there sometimes at night. The sound travels. So I went to the balcony, and I thought, like, what is going on there? And I could hear the sirens. And I said, what is going on? What is it? And then all of a sudden there was an explosion overhead. And then another one. And it was obvious that we were being attacked by rockets, and there were interceptions. And the kids ran to the room, and my wife went in the safe room. And I stood on the balcony just mesmerized by this explosions. And I went to look at my computer, and I saw in Arabic media, because my job is to do analysis, mostly in the Middle East, that they had said, the Al-Aqsa flood operation has begun. That's what Hamas had called it. And Hamas made all these claims, we've killed lots of people. And Hamas had called on Arabs in Israel to pick up butcher knives or whatever they had in their hands to start killing people. I mean, they hoped this would trigger a national uprising, something like the Tet Offensive or something. They thought this would wipe out Israel. The clock is ticking. I guess they hoped also Hezbollah would jump in and fight as well. And Hezbollah did join, but as you all know, it was not the massive attack Israel was worried about. So I had a friend of mine, all these stories are in the book. I had a friend of mine named Dr. Eric Mandel who comes to Israel, and he was staying down in the south in the Negev somewhere. And I called him. He said, let's go to Sderot. I said, great, I'm ready to go. I'll meet you there. So I got in my car. He was driving from Yeroham or something. And even at that time, this must have been about just after noon or so by that point, people in my neighborhood, I could see them coming to the cars, the younger men and women. They were all getting called up one by one. And that's how you I must have known it was serious. I mean, this is like the Yom Kippur War, what I've read about, people getting there. In those days, of course, someone would drive around and tell them that they were getting their call-up duties, and everyone was going to war. And it felt the same way because the streets were empty. Not only Shabbat in Jerusalem, no one drives anyway, but it was a holiday as well. And anyway, there's a war, and people aren't going to be rushing to the war zone unless they have a reason to go. So, it was just obvious that the people that you saw getting in their cars, and they're all young men, and they're going in their uniforms or they're whatever they are, these people are all going in the same direction as you are. So I drove down, and when we got on the way to Gaza, you pass a few military bases on the way. They don't advertise themselves as military base, but there's a little entrance, and wherever there was a little base, The road, the cars lined up at the front of the gate went on for miles. It was because the bases don't have a huge parking lot. So everyone had brought their civilian cars. And usually when the IDF calls people up, they don't call up everyone to the same bases. It's just a rotating number of people. So it was mass. It was like massive. I was like, this whole country is on the move. I mean, and I got down to near Sderot, and there was a checkpoint, a police checkpoint, and it was eerily quiet. There was no warplanes. As I remember the last wars I'd followed, there'd always been warplanes and helicopters, and on the radio we could hear where the interceptions were, and every once in a while we'd see them because, as we know now, Hamas fired something like 4,000 rockets at Israel the first day. I mean, it's absolutely a huge number. And it was a checkpoint. I called my friend Eric, who was in Sderot, and he was sending me pictures of dead bodies, and he said, these are terrorists that have just been killed. In fact, I think we found out later, we think they were civilians but usually in Israel, if there was a dead body somewhere that was left there for any period of time, it's usually a terrorist, and they might be scared he's booby-trapped or something. So there's no immediacy to take that body away. But if it was a civilian that had been killed, you'd take the civilian to a hospital and do the checks you're supposed to do. But there were so many dead bodies at that time, there was no way to do that. So Eric was saying, yeah, this is an active war zone. I said, Sderot, an active war zone. I mean, I was in Sderot. I mean, okay, it's an active war zone in the sense that there's rockets falling on, but terrorists in the city? So it was the first sign that things were really bad. And on the radio, we could hear people calling into the radio saying, my wife's phone is you know how on iPhone you can check where the phone is? My wife's phone is located in Khan Yunis. I can't get in touch with her. I mean, people were calling in frantic. They didn't know what to do. And the radio was trying to help them. So the radio would say, okay, if you are hearing this and you live in Kibbutz Cholit, could you go check on, so-and-so's house and see what? Well, the radio guys didn't know that Cholit and those places were overrun or been attacked. So no one's going out to check anything because those people are hiding in their safe rooms. But the radio was trying to help. A guy called in from Zikim Beach. He said, "I'm hiding in a culvert underneath the road, a little like a where you have water going under." He said, "I've been sitting here for hours. We're being bombarded by the Navy. There's terrorists everywhere." He said, "I don't know what to do." He said, "I'm just a fisherman. I was here in the morning. What do I do? Can someone come help me?" And they said, "Okay, we'll try to help you. We don't know what to do." That guy, I think, survived. But so the radio was this weird place where you could understand how everything was a chaos. And everyone was kind of getting updates themselves. No one really knew what was going on. It was just this total fog of war. And when I got to the border of Gaza and Yad Mordechai, it became crystal clear how bad it was, because there was a car that was lodged against an abutment and it was full of bullet holes. And there was a kind of sleeping bag next to it, a sack. And as I approached the sack, I realized it was a dead body, and they'd put something over this person. That body was there, and there were ambulances going back and forth. And they were not bothering with the body, because there were so many dead bodies, they couldn't deal with it. They were just trying to get wounded out. And so that body, by the way, stayed there for like 2 or 3 days, because I went back the next day and they hadn't taken that person away. They just didn't have the resources. And we saw that again and again. When we went there on October 8th, I had a friend of mine who went down with me, another journalist. He happened to have a sidearm, because you can get a gun license in Israel. It's unlike states where you can just go to Walmart and pick them up. So he had a pistol with him. I wasn't armed. And we, at that time, we knew how bad it was. We knew there's just total chaos here. It would be better to have a weapon. So I had a body armor and my helmet. He had a pistol. And I thought, well, we each got kind of half the equipment we need for this conflict. I don't know if you ever saw that movie about Stalingrad, where they send the guys into the battle and they say, you get the rifle, you get the bullets. Good luck. So it felt a bit like that. And we went up there to near Zikim. We didn't know how chaotic this was. We saw evidence of armored vehicles, because when a tank drives across the street, it leaves all the tread marks. So we could see evidence that like tanks had kind of been here, but we didn't know where they went. And we thought, well, the tanks are a good sign. That means we're back. We're in the fight at least. I mean, there's a tank here. How many terrorists can there be, right? But we got to the top of a ridgeline near Zikim, overlooking the beach, and we saw on the road that I wanted to drive down, there were 2 dead bodies that had been disintegrated by some sort of munition. They've been just blown to pieces. And I said to my friend, I think this is the end of the line. We're not going further. This is like zombie land. There's nothing. This is just the worst of the worst. And we looked to the left, and we saw inside the kibbutz a soldier crouched behind a little concrete stand looking at us like this. And I looked at him and I thought, we're civilians. we're media. I mean, actually, I had a little press sticker on the car. I thought, we're not terrorists. But he was sitting there looking out, and I thought, wait, if he's crouching and hiding, things can't possibly be good on my side out here. So we turned around and left. And then 3 days later, a dozen terrorists emerged from 100 meters from where we were and killed 3 Israeli soldiers from the elite Maglan unit just down the street. So it was pretty hairy. And I think we're lucky that we got out of there. I have my 20 or 30 minutes, and I'll take some questions. I should say that I've written several books. This is the first one I wrote. It's called After ISIS. It was about, I went to Iraq in 2015. You probably recall in 2014 that ISIS overran part of Iraq, and they massacred and genocided these people called Yazidis. It's a religious minority group that primarily lives in Iraq. And as you may recall, in those days, how bad it was. There was video back then of them being taken sex slaves, and they were kidnapped, and the ISIS massacred and genocided these people. Just absolutely the worst, brutal stuff, like pictures from the Holocaust, like the Einsatz group, and just massacring people. And they kidnapped the women. They held them as sex slaves. And I went to Iraq to cover it because I felt that I had a responsibility to cover it, because I felt it's a genocide, especially as a Jewish person. And I felt that it just, I wanted to be there. I felt that if I was there in 1941, I would have signed up to go. And I've been, you have a duty to go. And I'm a journalist, I'm not a soldier. So I went to cover it. I felt that the world should know what's happening. And I went to Sinjar. I got in there right when it was liberated from ISIS. I got in November 2015. We were some of the first ones to see some of the mass graves of the bodies of the Yazidis that had been killed. And it was what you could imagine. It was just absolutely awful. And I come back to Israel after that. And I remember I spent a lot of time with the Kurdish fighters. And they used to say, you Jews, Israel, you guys are so lucky. You have an army. You have a state. We Kurds, we wish we have a state, but we don't have tanks. We don't have F-35s. I wish you guys would help us. So we want to learn from the success you've had. And I always thought, it is a privilege to go back to Israel. Israel, of course, faces all these threats and terrorists, but we have F-35s. There's tanks. I mean, it's a huge army. I mean, this country's quite secure, right? It's very, what could possibly happen here? Yeah, there's terrorism. Terrorists come, they blow up a bus, or you have a lone wolf terrorist attack. That's bad luck. But actually, Israel's far more safe than many inner cities in the West. I mean, to be honest, your chances of being killed by terrorists here is pretty nil, to be honest, compared to the chances of being a victim of a stabbing attack in some place in Europe or whatever. So I always thought it was really safe. And then October 7th happened. And I remember being down there on the border and just feeling like there's no army, there's no F-35s. Where are the tanks? We finally found some of the tanks on October 8th. It was a reserve unit that had showed up. They'd driven all night. This crazy story. The reservists had come to the tank unit that's in central Israel. And the guys had got there. And the tanks were supposed to be ready to go because it's a unit it's a quick reaction force. And the guys got there, and the commander said, you know what? You're going to get on a bus. You're going to go to Gaza. We don't know. We're not going to use the tanks. Just go. We can't drive them because tanks are not supposed to drive on roads. They're supposed to be put on a truck, and then you take them somewhere. So the guys are sitting there saying, yeah, but we're trained to fight in tanks. I'm not an infantryman. Finally, the commander said, you know what? This is late in the day. This is late on October 7th. This is how slow things happened here. The commander said, you know what? Okay, get in the tanks. You'll drive on the side of Kavish, Route 6. And we'll have a civilian car will drive in front and tell you which back roads to use. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? You have tanks. Why don't you just drive straight through the field? They literally drove down Route 6. They got to a gas station at some point. They weren't getting gas for the tanks. I think the guys had to go take a pee. I don't know why they stopped. But he told me that they stopped at some point. It was nighttime now. It was like midnight. And he said there was a bus that had just come out, and they were people that had been evacuated from Gaza. And he said, that's how we knew how bad it was, besides the fact that they'd seen some of the videos on Telegram. We knew how bad it was. We saw the civilians. They said they came out the bus and they just had this 1,000-yard stare like they'd just been through hell. And he said, we understood now. We had to keep going. And they drove the tanks. They got to Sderot. The tanks split up. There were only like 6 of them. They split up. A few of them went around to Zikim, where my friend and I ran into them the next day. And a few of them went and fought in Kfar Aza and then some of the other areas, because there were so few tanks on the border that they needed these guys. And we ran into them the next day, and I ran into a friend of mine who was actually happened to be driving one of them. And he said to me, this is our Yom Kippur War. That's what this is. And he was right. He led the first tank that went into Gaza because Israel took 20 days to go into Gaza. They had to train the whole army they'd called up, 300,000 people. They had to retrain them to urban combat because the soldiers had not been refreshed their memory, because that's how bad the plans were. There were no plans to go into Gaza. No one thought Israel would ever have to go back. The commanders had never imagined this would happen. But in the end of the day, that's what I felt there was, I had gone to cover the genocide against the Yazidis, but it had prepared me then to cover the genocide here on October 7th. And we felt here as vulnerable as this poor Kurds and Yazidis and people felt there from an ISIS-like monster in Gaza, which it is. And now, of course, the state has sort of recovered. But I think the takeaway for me on October 7th was the degree to which everyone in this country was willing to do their duty. That maybe the general staff or the politicians or all the people in charge maybe didn't know what to do, or they failed here and there. It's fine, however you want to describe it. But the average person all just did what they were supposed to do. I went to a hospital the next day in Ashkelon, and we got to the entrance to the hospital. You guys see that. You guys deliver food, so you know what it means to deliver food. The hospital had 30 tables set up, and you know how a hospital, they have like a where you drive in quickly to put people in the ER, right? So next to it, the whole way to get in was filled with tables. Well, the analysts could still come in, but filled with tables, and there were people bringing food that were volunteers there, just bringing food. And we went inside. I thought this is going to be like, just bodies everywhere, and it'll be a chaos. There was no chaos. We went inside. We met one of the head nurses or whatever. They gave us an interview. We asked them, I said, well, are you overrun? They said, no, we're fine here. We've been ready for this. We've triaged the patients we had to. We sent them to other hospitals. We've handled hundreds of people, wounded people. We've had a few that passed overnight, but mostly we've saved all the lives we could. And we're fine. We're fine. We're okay. And it's crazy to think about it, because it's a mass casualty event. More than 1,000 dead, thousands of people wounded. And yet the medical services here were fine. Everything worked fine. So even though there was a breakdown at the top, this society here is just incredibly resilient. And you see that. So I think I'll end the talk there, because it's more than 30 minutes, and then take questions or whatever you like. Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I should say, just as a point of how the book is written, it's in 3 parts, and this will help to answer your question in a second. So I wanted to write a book about October 7th, and some people said, well, how can you write the book? It just happened, because I started writing it a month after it happened, because I was visiting every IDF unit on the border. I thought, I have crazy access here. I've literally, throughout the war, I interviewed more than half the units in the field. And I thought this has to go onto paper. And I'd covered the IDF since 2005. I've been there. I just thought I have a lot of knowledge about this. I should write about this. So the book is organized into 3 parts. It's the lead up to the day itself. Then it's the day itself, the first hour, the first day, and the first week or so. That's the second part of the book. And the third part is how Israel fought the war for the first 9 months or so. So the first part of the book is this drumbeat, how we got here. And I wrote the book that I wanted to read, because if I wanted to read about Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or the Tet Offensive or whatever you'd like, the Battle of Adrianople, I don't know, I would want to read a book like that. I want to read a bit about how they got here, how it happened. And then I'd want to read about the thing itself, and then what was the aftermath. So I was thinking about the lead up to 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. You have all this information that comes trickling in, right? That before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy disappeared suddenly from the coast of Japan. People were like, well, where did it go? Because it takes a bit of time to steam out there. Before 9/11, that infamously there were CIA guys or whatever in Afghanistan. They knew where bin Laden was, kind of. They even had a Predator drone flying around, but it wasn't armed, and they couldn't use it to kill him. So, they had all this information trickling in, and people didn't know what to do with all of it, unfortunately. And sometimes there was good luck, like at Pearl Harbor, none of the U.S. carriers were there, and it ended up being a war which carriers were very necessary. So it actually, even though it was tragic, the loss of 1 or 2 battleships in the end of the day didn't matter that much in the Pacific. But so I was trying to understand that. I had been on the border of Gaza before the war so many times And I'd even taken interns from the Jerusalem Post to the border, and we'd been in the Zikim Beach. I'd taken them to an area called the Black Arrow site, which is next to Kibbutz Mefal, so next to Gaza. These are areas you can see the border. You can see Gaza, and you can see people working the fields across the way. So, I felt safe, and I think the thing in Israel was, it's what led to this. On the Israeli side, it was complacency and arrogance. Israel felt, the general staff, the security establishment, they all felt, if you'd ask them, well, what about Hamas? They'd say, Hamas is nothing. It's a joke. It doesn't matter. It's weak. It's deterred. Whatever the answer is. It was total groupthink. By the way, if you read about the Yom Kippur War, it's not like that. There were people that believed in the concept that, like, no, the enemy's not going to attack us. They will eventually, but not tomorrow, whatever. But there were people before Yom Kippur War saying, no, they're going to attack. They're going to attack. What should we do? And by the way, before the Yom Kippur War, Israel began to call up reservists bit by bit. They weren't asleep at the wheel the way it was on October 7th. In fact, Golda Meir was asked by her defense minister, Moshe Dan, just 6 hours before Yom Kippur War started. Madam Prime Minister, that there's kids in the Golan in the communities. And what if the war, I know we think the war is not going to happen, but what do you think we should do in case maybe it's going to happen? And Golda said, no, get all the kids out now. And they said, and I think Moshe Dan said, well, yeah, but it might cause a panic. Golda said, I don't care, get the kids out. They evacuated the children hours before the war started. That saved lives. If they'd done that on the border of Gaza hours before, because when the intelligence warnings began to trickle in, overnight, October 6th to October 7th, as the hours counted down to the disaster, the information was trickling in. But no one made that decision. Evacuate the communities. Call up, Israel's communities in the Gaza border, they all have what's called the Konanut. They have a security teams of civilians, but people that are all usually former soldiers and former special forces. So these communities, by the way, they've done all sorts of weird things in the border before October 7th. They'd taken away some of the rifles from some of the communities, not all the rifles, but they'd reduced the number of weapons that were in civilian hands. And they'd asked, the people had to secure them in like a lockbox somewhere. So they didn't have the M16s at home. They were in some armory. Well, if you've been to the kibbutzim, you got to run from your house to the armory. The Hamas guys targeted the armory first. I mean, Hamas was very smart. So the thing is, but on the communities that were ready, they were really ready. And like Kibbutz Magen, which I tell a little bit of story in the book. In Kibbutz Magen, not only did the security team acquire extra rifles because the guy in charge of it said, I need more weapons because there's a school nearby. What if I have to defend the school? Give me more weapons. And he stockpiled extra ammunition. And he just said, I know this is going to happen one day. They're going to break through. And he trained the guys again and again and again. And one of the guys in the team went out to have a cigarette at 6:20 in the morning, right before the attack happened. And he happened to be having a cigarette that morning. He wasn't allowed to smoke at home because his wife didn't want him to. So he was looking over to Gaza, and he started seeing the people coming through, and he said, my God. And he sounded the alarm. Everyone went to their positions. They waited for Hamas to come. About 30 Hamas members came up the road from behind the kibbutz. And they waited like at the Battle of Bunker Hill. They just waited, and they gunned them all down. A few of the guys were killed in the security team, but everyone in that community, everyone lived. Why? Because they weren't arrogant, they weren't complacent. They didn't laugh at the Hamas members because they said, no, these people are evil, they have to take them seriously. So that's the difference between life and death. And unfortunately, the general staff in Israel and all the security state, not only were they complacent and arrogant, it's about Hamas. It's not that they were complacent and arrogant about everything else. They all were focused on Hezbollah and Iran as the main threat. And I covered this war for many years, so I remember we would hear 90% of the resources are focused on the north. Gaza, it doesn't matter anymore. And unfortunately, it did matter, and Hamas taught us that it mattered. And everyone learned the hard way that you can't just let these things fester. It's like this cartels in Mexico or whatever. I mean, I remember going to Mexico when I was younger in the 90s, late 90s, when the PRI ran the country, and then the early 2000s before the war with the cartels. And there wasn't, Mexico was a bit dangerous, a little bit, but it wasn't the cartel violence that now in Mexico's been a war zone over the last decades, right? It's like the number of people massacred by these cartels is huge. So these things can fester for a while and then explode. right? And I think that's what happened. In the end of the day, the other side of the coin is the enemy gets a vote also. And Hamas planned this for a long, long time. They sat and they planned and they sat and they planned. And they have nothing else to do in Gaza. I mean, unfortunately, that's the reality of it, right? These guys sat there in places like Khan Yunis. Most of these guys are born in Khan Yunis, they die in Khan Yunis. They never leave where they're. Yahya Sinwar and all his people, they're basically a mafia gang of murderers. And he got his name as the butcher of Khan Yunis like in the late 80s because he was murdering Palestinians he claimed were collaborators. He used to kill them with his own hands. He's a monster. He was allowed out of prison and he sat there and planned this for years and he had nothing else to do with his life. I mean, in the sense, Hamas took over Gaza, the international community appeased them, the UN and others seemed to work with them, and Hamas just sat there and said, okay, great, we'll just we'll plan this. And they tested Israel with rockets and other things, and they saw how the Israelis responded. They saw this $1 billion fence Israel built, but we all know fences don't usually work very well in warfare. Did the Great Wall of China work? Did Hadrian's Wall work? Did the Maginot Line work? Fences don't usually work. They only work in a way they can slow enemies down. But this crazy $1 billion fence that had remote-controlled guns on it that could, I think that can shoot a bit by bit, but you can't take out 100 guys with it. It's too slow. And Hamas neutralized them with like drones and simple things. So unfortunately, that's what happened. I think the tragedy for Israel is, unlike the 73 war, this wave of attack broke on civilians who bore the brunt of the massacre. And also things like, for instance, the IDF had a lot of women soldiers on the border. You know, it's great to have women soldiers. It's good to have, you know, diversity and things like that in the army, but you should arm them. The women soldiers on the border, none of them were armed. I mean, they were observers. Their job was, that was their tafkid. So I understand it's like you don't arm nurses in a hospital, but the point is, the soldiers' job was to be watching cameras and stuff in Gaza. They weren't trained fighters. So you have a base like Nahal Oz, they had 162 soldiers in the base, of which more than half were unarmed or non-combat soldiers. So they had no chance. And you know, there were only 700 or so soldiers on the border on October 7th, and they were facing 30,000 Hamas members. Now, that's not how many crossed the border, but Hamas had 30,000 fighters against 700 soldiers. They sent 3,000 or 4,000 people across the border. The IDF soldiers never had a chance. I mean, that's just the reality of it. And any commander who looked at that should have thought, I don't have enough resources here. But, you know, it's like the Tet Offensive. The American army in Vietnam could have had the ability to probably defeat the Viet Cong if they'd had the right people in the right place. They didn't, and it took months to defeat them.
So, first sort of hyperbolic plan for the day after. We've heard the Arab coalition plan that came out of Egypt. Do you have a sense of what you think Israel wants? Or if not, then do you have a sense of what you think is the best answer for the day after?
Right. So that's a good question. And there's two different things, right? What Israel's current leadership seems to not, I mean, Israel's current leadership does not seem to have a plan for Gaza. We hear stories about total victory and the other things, gates of hell opening, but that's not really a plan, to be honest. I mean, it's just a slogan without what's inside, right? So if I say total victory, you can say, okay, well, what does it mean? Okay, so the government here has not come up with what they'd like it to look like. And when you don't have a plan for a place like Gaza, we all know the phrase in science, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, when there's a vacuum of power, who's going to run Gaza? Hamas. Because that's who runs it anyway. That's who the people kind of like. So they're the Hamas is the norm. So in the absence of a plan, I think that Hamas will run it. I think that the Israeli government is not really clear. As they have said, Netanyahu or others said in their own words, not Hamas and not the Palestinian Authority. Well, what do you get? What do you get in Gaza if you don't have Hamas and you don't have the Palestinian Authority? You get a vacuum. Who runs the vacuum? Hamas. So unfortunately, the mathematical equation tells you exactly what is going to end up. And I think, therefore, unless you hear a plan to replace the governing authority of Hamas, you can't replace a terrorist group with nothing. I mean, I was in the Battle of Mosul. When they replaced ISIS, they replaced it with the government of Iraq. They got rid of ISIS and they brought something in. And the fact is, ISIS preyed off the fact the Sunni Arab cities were not governed well under Nouri al-Maliki for years. That's why ISIS took over part of Iraq, because there was a vacuum and they jumped into the vacuum. And they were the natural thing that exists because they were Sunni Arabs, so, and a bunch of other jihadists, but they were the natural thing that appears when there's a vacuum and chaos. So unfortunately, that's kind of where things sit in Gaza. I think the Egyptian plan, it's interesting. It's the opposite of the Israeli plan, because the Israeli plan seems to primarily be a slogan with not a lot of clarity. The Egyptian plan is like 100 pages of stuff without anything at the top, really. So it's like, yeah, okay, you're going to have a bureaucracy that kind of controls this, but we're not going to have Hamas, but we're not really sure. It's like, yeah, okay, but again, you've got a lot of stuff here, but what's the thing that's going to gel it together? So unfortunately, you've got a lot of different things out there and not a lot of clarity in terms of how it will happen. If you ask me what I think should happen, I think it's very clear, because I was in the battle against ISIS and I understand how that worked. When they fought ISIS, I should say, because the U.S. coalition ran it and it was 70 countries. So when we fought ISIS, what we did was very smartly, I think. And Mosul, by the way, is the same size as Gaza. It's like 2 million people, and it's about the same size. So they evacuated all the people. And the people were coming. It took a long time. It's a city of like 2 million people and its environs. They took a long time to get them all out. Finally, most of the people left. The battle, by the way, in Mosul started in October of 2016, and it went until June, July of 2017, okay? So it started in October, just like when October 7th happened. So I would say the Battle of Gaza could have been over by July of the next year if Israel had kind of done what the Iraqis did. But what Israel did was it did evacuate civilians, but where did it evacuate them to? It evacuated them to a place that was run by Hamas. Well, if you want to get rid of the organization, you can't let them run all the civilians, because they live off of that. They prey off of it. So the way to win in Gaza is to clear an area of Gaza. You could clear that area of Mawasi. By the way, you know why it's an open land there in Mawasi, and they can move civilians there. It used to be Gush Katif. It used to be Jewish communities. That's why there's nothing there now. So anyway, you could go in with IDF, cordon it off, and let the civilians come behind your lines. The IDF doesn't want to deal with civilians and run their lives. I get it. Their armies aren't good at running civilians' life. So you'd have to have some sort of Arab coalition thing running it, kind of, but the IDF running the fence around it, but then let someone else deal with them. Fine. You get the civilians out. Then you go in and go street by street. Like I was in Iraq, we went street by street and killed every single member of the people, the enemy, that we could find. When it was over, they were gone. There was nothing left of the ISIS, nothing. And that worked. It worked great. Iraq, Mosul is a thriving city today. Iraq is a messed up country, and it's not great. Iraq in general has problems. It has Shia militias. It has Iranian problems of corruption, drugs. The Kurdish region works great. The rest of Iraq is a bit of a mess. But Mosul as a city is basically okay now. It's not full of terrorists. So it can be done, but you have to decide to do it. Of course, Israel is not the government of Iraq. Israel doesn't want to run Gaza. I get it. So someone has to run it. And if Israel doesn't want the PA to run it, then some other organization should run it. But this is the problem. You have to have something there. And again, it's the same thing with cartels in Sinaloa. If you're not willing to go in and run it, then they will run it. And that's the same. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. It's always the same story. And this is the problem in Gaza. And that's where we are. So I have a way I think it should be done. I don't think Israel has exactly spelled out a strategy. Maybe it's a secret one. Like Nixon had a secret plan to end Vietnam. So I don't know. There could be a secret strategy. And the Egyptians have an idea, but it's, again, why did it take 16 months for the Egyptians to put up this plan? It should have been done 16 months ago. The Arab state should have stepped up early and said, okay, this is a disaster. We shouldn't have let Qatar fund Hamas. Let's do the other thing. Why is there so much irresponsibility by the international community to deal with this? Again, it's also their fault. So, this is an incredibly difficult challenge for Israel, because Hamas has been taking hostages since the 90s. And Israel, by the way, in the old days, I don't know if maybe you probably know this, in the early years of Israel, from 48 to the 80s, Israel never allowed hostages to be taken. They immediately went in and killed whoever was taking them, at the risk of killing a bunch of civilians as well. So there was a massacre in the north, in Malat Tarshiha, the terrorists took a bunch of children hostage at a school, and the IDF went there and said, okay, you have a few hours to deal with this. okay, we're just going to go and we'll kill everyone here. And a bunch of hostages died, but they felt it was always worth it to send a message to the enemy. You're not taking these. You're not going to do this. We'll kill all of you. And that's how Israel dealt with hostages. That's what happened in Entebbe, right? In Entebbe, they didn't say, well, there's hostages there. Let's just leave them in Uganda. No. They said, okay, you guys prepare a plan. We're going to fly to Uganda. And that's just crazy. They could have all been killed. Not only the hostages, but also the planes. They could have been massacred. It didn't matter. We're going to fly to Uganda. We're going to kill the terrorists. We'll bring all the hostages back, whatever it takes. And that was always Israel's mentality when it came to hostage taking historically. The view was you might be lucky as a terrorist and get a few of us, but you're sure as heck not going to hold them for very long. We will come in and get you. And if we have to, civilians will die in the process of that, unfortunately. But Israel changed eventually. And Israel in the 80s and 90s chose negotiations, especially because in some cases, Israel had POWs, by the way, held abroad. So I shouldn't say, we talk about hostages. There were cases, of course, where Israel had POWs come home after the war. So there were cases. What happened with Israel was, you had soldiers that got caught by Hezbollah in Lebanon in the 80s. And then you say, well, it's a hostage in a sense because there's a terrorist group holding them. The terrorist group views them as a prisoner of war or whatever. So at that point, Israel began to talk to terrorists like Hezbollah, and they would do deals. And there started to be more and more deals done. So I think, Israel began to shift its view and mentality in terms of this issue, that it's preferable to do a deal than risk massive numbers of lives. And the state changed a bit in its approach. And I can't say which is right or wrong or morally right or wrong. Maybe, is it morally right to leave a person as a hostage for a year, but the person survives at the end and you trade terrorists for them and you get the person back, but the person is like Gilad Shalit was left for 5 years. The person might be mentally, deeply, badly affected for the rest of their life. And you say, well, would it have been preferable on the first day that Shalit was kidnapped to send in an armored tank division and kill as many people as possible to get him out? And maybe he dies, but maybe he doesn't. And is that which risk is better? And it's not an easy choice to make. But Israel has decided, I think after October 7th, that we can't rescue them all. There's too many of them. We can't free them by force because they'll probably be killed in the process. There's too many of them, again. And that's why, by the way, Israel, I guess why the IDF refused to go in or didn't go into the central camps of Gaza. During the war in Gaza, as I wrote in the book, the IDF went into northern Gaza. It went into Khan Yunis. It went into Rafah. It went into Netzarim. It's like painting a bunch of little squares, but they never bothered to get into the central camps, which apparently is maybe where the hostages were held. So Israel has never conquered all of Gaza, despite 16 months of fighting. It only conquered maybe 60 or 70%. That's why Hamas emerged immediately. And I think the decision was, Israel felt they just can't go in. It can't risk their lives. And I'm sure the leadership felt, if they ended up going in and a lot of these people were killed, because I don't think the leadership was afraid of the issue of civilian casualties and killing Hamas members. I don't think that's not what held them back. It was, I think, primarily the issue of hostages. They would feel then that that blood was on their hands. So, but unfortunately, again, we know that the hostages were dying bit by bit throughout the year, right? Hirsch Goldberg and all these hostages were killed. So, and people would say, yeah, but they could have been saved if there was a deal a year ago. Well, yeah, that's true also. But they also could have been maybe saved in a military operation because they were in a tunnel in northern Gaza. And one of the guys, actually an Arab hostage, was able to get out and was saved from nearby. So maybe they could have been saved by more bold, maybe reckless, but more bold Entebbe-like raids. So the hostage thing has made it impossible for Israel to fight this war. It's incredibly difficult and very hard to end this thing. And unless you had an approach like I think Israel's early leadership would have said, is that's fine. We'll go into Gaza. We'll take it over. We'll find every hostage dead or alive. Because I think they had a very different mentality in the 60s. They would not have let this happen. And by the way, if this had happened in 1960, I think the IDF would have immediately gone into Gaza on October 7th. And they would have been in total chaos, but they probably would have rescued more people sooner because Hamas was totally also in chaos that day. The IDF now is a much more plodding, slow style Western military with massive investment in high tech and not enough investment in ground troops and things. Now, in other conflicts, you have hostages. In Nigeria, Boko Haram takes hostages. ISIS kidnapped Yazidis. Did the Iraqi army fight the war against ISIS as if the Yazidi kidnapped people mattered? No, they didn't. That was never an issue for them. I don't remember in that Battle of Mosul anyone wondering if we'd find Yazidis. I mean, No one seemed to think that was a priority to deal with that. So in most other wars, the issue of the hostages is not a big priority. And I should note that, ISIS held American hostages. Not only did they behead a few of them, like Mr. Foley and Sotloff, but Kayla Mueller was held by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Kayla Mueller was probably maybe killed in the U.S. airstrike. It's not clear. But I don't think anyone thought about that. I mean, I don't think it was it's not a main priority. Finding Austin Tice was not a main priority. Finding John Cantley, who's also disappeared in the ISIS wars, is also not a priority. So I think a lot of countries just don't view that as a main priority in a time of major conflict. And they understand that unfortunately, you just can't rescue everyone. But Israel's a very small country. Everyone here knows each other. It's a very homogenous society in a way, although, yeah, it's actually the opposite of homogenous in a way. But in terms of the nature of how Israelis feel about themselves, there's such a solidarity here. The idea of having hostages killed in a failed rescue mission or killed by the enemy because the IDF got too close traumatizes people here. So for a country like Israel, it's very difficult to fight this kind of war. I think for a lot of countries, they're just very different than Israel. And that's why I don't think that Nigeria fights Boko Haram the same way. And I don't think the hostage issue has the same hold over Nigeria. And that's for many different reasons. But I think many countries, most countries don't have 250 people missing. But some countries do. In Ukraine, the Russians have kidnapped children. I understand that they've taken children from orphanages and stuff. So lots of conflicts have kidnapping of people. The Chechens used to kidnap Russians. I mean, so lots of bad groups do horrible things. I think a lot of countries don't face the exact same thing Israel does, and they don't. It's not an insult to them to say that they just don't have the exact same type of solidarity that you have in Israel. And that's nothing against them. If you're a big country like America of 300 million people, Kayla Mueller doesn't really matter as much, to be honest, to most Americans. I don't think. Unfortunately, I say that as an American. I don't think most Americans got up at night worrying what's happened to Kayla Mueller. People in Israel get up every night worried what's happened to this girl, the idea of women soldiers. Their pictures were everywhere. I live in America. I never saw a picture of Kayla Mueller anywhere in America, or Sotloff or Foley. So, and that's not because America's a bad place. Lots of people care about that. It's too big a place, I think. And that's why I think it's hard to kill on a big scale. And Israel's just this very tiny little place that everything is very connected. So the question is about Israel's Syria policy and whether or not how the relations with the Druze will work out, and whether Turkey, how its role will end up there. So that's very important. I think Syria is a fascinating country going through quick transitions now. Israel's leaders have talked a lot about minorities there. We've heard statements about helping the Kurds and the Druze. And the Druze are, a group of people that generally in Israel are, they're part of Israeli society and people like them. And I think they're seen as a potential, friend there, ally. And the Kurds are certainly very pro-Israel, generally tend to be quite pro-Jewish or pro-Israel in the region. So I would generally say, Israel is not in the game today like the 60s of sending people to all sorts of weird, complicated missions. So I think the ability of Israel to project power into the Druze area in Syria would be very difficult. And I think, we forget, you'd have to cross 20 miles of open country full of Sunni Syrians, Arabs who, probably don't really want Israel driving across their area to get to the Druze mountain. So I think the chances of something real happening there is pretty slim. I think Israel's messaging can have an effect if the Syrian government understands Israel's watching. So don't pull a fast one on us. Don't kill these people. Where Israel might help the Druze is right along the border in Al-Hadar. It's a small village near Major Shams. There's a few little Druze villages where Israel, I think, is capable of doing little bits of work there because Israel has worked in southern Syria during the civil war to help, by the way, usually to help the Syrian rebels who are mostly Sunni Arabs. So Israel has a history of helping there. Even treating Syrians in Israeli hospitals. So I think where we could see that happen is just along the border, 1 or 2 square miles inside. That's about it. That's my sense. I just don't see a lot more than that besides messaging. The Turkish role in Syria is a complicated one. Turkey has not played a good role in Syria. It has supported not only the Syrian rebel, some of the Syrian rebels are fine. It supported the worst rebels. Turkey was like, oh, let's look at Syria. Oh, these guys are kind of nice and moderate. These people are a bunch of gangs. Let's help the gangs out. So, why? Because Turkey wanted to support groups that don't like the Kurds. It's not because the Turks necessarily like these groups, the gangs. They just chose the worst types of people because they wanted them to fight the Kurds, and the Syrian rebels wanted to fight the Assad regime. So the Turks co-opted the worst groups. Now, that, by the way, the group that runs Syria today, Ahmed Shara's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, he's not from the bad groups like the Turks support. You could say, okay, he's connected to Al-Qaeda somehow back in the day, but he seems to have reformed himself a bit. He wasn't the main Turkish proxy. So the Turks might dial back the proxies they've supported against the Kurds, maybe, but Turkey's overall goal in Syria will be to take over where the Russians and Iranians left. And they will fill the vacuum that I've talked about a lot here. Turkey will become the new power there, unless the Saudis and others step up. The track record of Gulf monarchies is that they are very good at giving money, but they're not actually good at doing hard power. And they generally don't do a very great job of it when they've had to deal with places like Sudan or Libya, or Yemen, infamously. So I would say that Turkey is a very serious country. It's a NATO member. It's extremely high-tech, very, very well organized country. It has the capability to play a huge role in Syria. And that would set it on a collision course with Israel, unfortunately, especially under the current Turkish regime. If Erdogan leaves power, which all people eventually leave power, then Turkey, by the way, could go back to being a nice, kind of friendly country. But Erdogan's regime is not great. And I think that would set Israel up for a collision course. And that's by the way, I think is why Israel's messaging about a demilitarized zone in the south, because they want to put this new government on notice. We see what you're doing. We want to play an influence role here too as well. Now that could backfire and cause the Turks to go in faster. But I think Israel is saying, listen, we're not going to let anything happen there too close to our border, like Turkish air defense suddenly popping up, which would be very bad for Israel, because Israel would be on a collision course with NATO, and that would be an utter disaster. So I think that, everyone must tread carefully, and Turkey can play a positive role if they do construction and they build highways and airports. By the way, the Erbil International Airport and most of the Kurdistan region in Iraq, it functions extremely well, primarily because of Turkish banks and Turkish highways and Turkish hotels and the Turkish airports. I mean, the Turks built a lot of stuff there because it's close to Turkey. So it's not all a bad story with Turkey. Turkey can play a good role. If it's a military role and an anti-Israel role, it can be very bad. The question is about whether or not Netanyahu should have resigned or whether he should be supported in this war. Look, insofar as the office of prime minister is fighting the war, then obviously, as he's prime minister, Israel should be supported, because in a sense, it's not a question of a one man; it's a question of the entity, and Israel has to fight this war. Whether or not Netanyahu should resign, I think it's, in general, in parliamentary democracy, when someone fails, like Neville Chamberlain, for instance, his failure to understand the Nazis. Neville Chamberlain, by the way, was a very honorable, good man. But he failed to understand what the Nazis were about to do, and he resigned correctly. And Churchill came in and set things right. So usually in parliamentary democracy, if you've made a huge mistake, you eventually go, you leave. And I think that Netanyahu probably should make that decision if he wants at some point, or whatever. People can ask him to leave. I think that he's been in power a very long time, and I think that he would like to stay there, and he'd like to try to right things or have an election, and so he will try to stay. I'm sure from his point of view, he would say, well, FDR didn't resign after Pearl Harbor. And that's right. FDR, by the way, I think if I pooled people, I don't know, in this room, and I said, do you hold FDR responsible for Pearl Harbor? I think a lot of people would say, well, not really. I mean, people make mistakes. The military made mistakes. I mean, Pearl Harbor was probably inevitable, kind of. I mean, it's just bad luck, and sometimes you mess up. So I don't think FDR is held personally responsible for that. And so Netanyahu could make the claim and say, yeah, but in other world leaders, when there was a disaster, even a military disaster, like Tet in Vietnam, I mean, did anyone get held responsible for Tet? Was Westmoreland in charge? I think he was. Well, I think he was eventually put out to pasture. I don't think he was fired for Tet. He was just left. The only general in American history, I think one of them was fired, and from his it was MacArthur was fired, but that's because for other reasons. And Lincoln, of course, fired half his generals because they were all disaster. But Lincoln, by the way, didn't resign because of Bull Run or whatever. So I think, there's two sides to it. I think that Netanyahu could make a very good claim that lots of people fail in history, and when you fail, you try to keep going. And I think people could make a very good point in saying, yeah, but actually, generally also, people, when they fail that badly, they leave. So,
Seth, my goodness, there are so many more questions in this room. I know I have a bunch of others myself. But we want to thank you. Thank you for taking the time to come and share with us. It's been an absolute honor. You will be around to sign some books, to
For the live stream, you should tell how much the book is and where the people can buy it.
Yes. The book is available on Amazon. The October 7th War. We will also, when we record the live stream and make it available on YouTube, we will do so. And we will give a link to the book where you can go and you can buy this book. I highly recommend this book. I thought I was going to go to bed. I'm just going to read the foreword before I fall asleep. The next morning at 3:35, I finished it.
Same here.
Seth, thank you very, very much.